Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you who are in different parts of the world. I would like to thank you for joining us today. Without making it too long, let me introduce the Director of BDT, Doreen Bogdan, so she can give us the opening remarks, and then probably after that, Nick will take over and we'll have a discussion on NCS. Thank you. Doreen, the floor is yours. I think you are muted, yeah. Can someone unmute Doreen, please?
Okay, thank you for that. I was also muted, Orhan. So good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I heard we have some early risers with us today. We heard some colleagues waking up at 3 in the morning, so a special good morning to you. I'm very pleased to be joining all of you today to discuss this very important subject of cybersecurity, which is an integral part of our digital strategies. We have all had cyber incidents, whether as institutions, organizations, or even as individuals. Cyber crimes and cyber attacks have become commonplace, plaguing online users. And this, of course, requires a collective responsibility for all of us to see how we can really make cyberspace more secure and also increase the confidence of the users to this critical resource. As we have our eyes on bringing the unconnected 3.6 billion people online, we must also give equal attention to areas that may hinder the meaningful and effective use of the web. Digital is the future of development. It cuts across every sector of the economy, and we must make sure that it is secure. Many countries that have embraced the digital transformation journey are launching strategies and initiatives to improve connectivity and to find ways to leverage the benefits of ICTs and to increase efficiency. I think we all know that COVID-19 has really put the spotlight on connectivity, as well as the need for resilient digital infrastructure. It has also been an accelerant for digital transformation. And today, we really find ourselves at a critical point, trying to leverage the transformational power of ICTs for economic growth and social development, while at the same time, rapidly evolving cyber risks are threatening the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of ICT infrastructure and services. People's trust and confidence in the use of ICTs are eroding due to cyber insecurity. And of course, these concerns have really been highlighted throughout this COVID pandemic. Cybercrime damages are projected to exceed a staggering $6 trillion in 2021. Financial institutions, tech companies, hospitals, government agencies, and just about every other sector are investing in cybersecurity infrastructure to protect their business practices and the millions of customers that trust them with their data. And from our perspective, this is why comprehensive national cybersecurity strategies are so important. And this is a point that was also well noted in the UN Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap that was launched just a few months ago, where he highlighted the importance of trust, security, and stability. To reap the benefits and manage the challenges of digitization, countries need to be focused on the importance of ICT-enabled infrastructure with comprehensive national cybersecurity strategies. These strategies seek to respond to cyber risks by coordinating actions for prevention, preparation, response, and incident recovery between government authorities and other stakeholders. And at the ITU, as many of you know, we engage in ongoing cybersecurity projects, activities, and regular interactions in many countries to raise awareness and to help build the needed skills. These activities aim to really instigate strategic reflection into national cybersecurity activities and outcomes, including support to national policymakers to help them develop, establish, and also to implement national cybersecurity strategies and capacities. The COVID crisis has also prompted us to further broaden this initial vision and the reach of our national cybersecurity support to also include digital training, as well as formative activities on cybersecurity governance at the national level. And I wanted to highlight very quickly a couple of examples. To improve readiness and incident response capabilities of developing countries, we conduct annual cyber drill exercises and technical trainings. Some of you may have been joining into our global cyber drill that's been running over the past several weeks. We also try to help countries develop similar capabilities at the national level when possible. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some of the work that we're doing in the space of child online protection and trying to work to mitigate online harms, especially for the most vulnerable amongst us, that is our children and our youth. We launched around the time that the UNSG launched the Digital Cooperation Roadmap, we launched our latest child online protection guidelines. And we will be having a session later today to share those guidelines in a regional context in the Americas region. And then, of course, our work in the space of national cybersecurity strategies, which is what we're going to talk about today. In September, we, working together with 20 international partners from the private and public sectors, from academia, from civil society, we started the process to update our second edition of the Guide to Developing a National Cybersecurity Strategy. This guide is really intended to trigger strategic discussions and also to help national leaders and policymakers to develop and implement their national cybersecurity strategies. It's comprised of a set of principles based on a range of experiences, knowledge, and expertise of stakeholders. The second edition update, I think, could not be more timely to address the new challenges, many challenges that we have seen throughout this COVID pandemic. And when we look back to the first edition of the guide in 2018, I would say we're very encouraged to see the number of cybersecurity strategies worldwide have significantly increased. When we first did our Global Cybersecurity Index back in 2018, our data showed us that only 76 countries had adopted a national cybersecurity strategy. Our more recent data shows us that 120 countries have these strategies in place or under development, which I think is very encouraging. And of course, at the ITU, with our hybrid membership base, which comprises 193 member states, our 900 members from industry, regional, pan-governmental bodies, academia, civil society, and research institutes, I think we bring a unique platform to the fore for collaboration. We consider multi-stakeholder partnerships as part of our DNA. It is the basis virtually of all of our work, both at headquarters as well as in the field. And I simply want to invite all of you to continue to collaborate with us to ensure that the online world is safe for current and future users. And to do that, we really need to advance real and implementable solutions in a partnership way. And as the UN Secretary General stated when he launched the roadmap back in June, it is important for all of us to redouble our efforts to better harness the potential of digital technologies while mitigating the harm that they may cause. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to address you today. And I wish you a successful webinar. Thank you very much. Orhan, back to you.
Thank you, Doreen. Thank you for these incredible remarks. And now I would like to pass the floor to Nick. But before Nick takes over, I think Andrea Rigoni is not connected yet. Maybe let's see if he connects in the meantime. Thank you. Back.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Orhan. And thank you, Doreen, for those opening remarks as well. I am Nick Espinoza. I am the Chief Security Fanatic of Security Fanatics here in Chicago in the United States. I'm also the official spokesperson for the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition and the creators of the 5 Laws of Cybersecurity. So I'm very happy to be here with ITU moderating this wonderful discussion with some of the top cybersecurity experts around the globe. I think everybody here is going to agree that adopting and developing a national cybersecurity strategy for any country is of paramount importance here. That is obviously just beyond critical in this day and age with the proliferation of criminal hacking and everything else. So with that, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items before we start actually with the panel and have them introduce themselves for us. And as Orhan mentioned, we are waiting for Andrea, and hopefully he will be here. So somebody just please send me a message in chat when Andrea shows up, because I see a lot of people on my screen right now, and I want to make sure I don't miss him. So with that, please make sure that your microphones are muted. The ITU has somebody that will go through and check that out for you, but make sure that you are keeping those muted, because obviously we want to give the full attention to whoever is speaking on the panel, at the time. Photos or screenshots are going to be taken throughout the session, and we request that the speakers and the moderator, myself, basically keep our cameras on and all of that during the session, so the ITU is able to get some really good screenshots as well. Also, please use chat only for raising questions related to the topic, that we are talking about. This will actually obviously help us moderate what is essentially going to be a large meeting with a lot of people. The one thing that we are not going to be straying into is politics of any country or organization, primarily because I think everybody here can agree that cybersecurity is essentially agnostic to the political system. We all need it, and so let's make sure that we are making sure of that. We're also going to be using a platform called Mural, which is actually very interesting. It's an online visual collaborative workspace. If you guys want to show that on the screen right now, ITU. And basically, we're going to be gathering main recommendations that are spurring from this discussion, and a link to the Mural page will shortly be posted in the chat. And then you can obviously use the chat platform to make any, there it is, to make any comments or questions and all of that. ITU moderators will be monitoring audience input throughout the discussions, as myself as well will be looking for questions that I can be inserting, absolutely into everything as the speakers are talking and all of that. So I think we're going to have a pretty good time. There is going to be a recording of Mural and everything else. It's going to be compiled actually into a recommendation paper on empowering women in cybersecurity, which is absolutely a wonderful thing. And finally, the chat and video recording, and this is being recorded. You should be able to see that in the top left of your Zoom window there, may be used for ITU reports, materials, and other things. So just heads up on that. That's where we're at, and that's where we're at now. That said, let's start introducing our panel. Apparently Andrea is on now, so thank you for that, Chris. And Andrea, why don't you, and for the record, if I pronounce anybody's name wrong, please correct me. I apologize in advance, and we'll go from there. But Andrea, why don't you introduce yourself first so we know you're here, and just basically give your basic bio, and thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm very sorry I joined late, but this is, welcome to the crazy world of Zoom calls, all day. It's like, an airplane, if it takes off, the first flight late, and then, so 32 years in cybersecurity. I've just learned one thing in my life, that's, cybersecurity, got passionate about big problems, big challenges. And it looks like, governments are in the best position. Worked many years, both for the advisory side, spent a few years in Buzala and Hamilton, but then I also worked for governments. I served my prime minister as head of cybersecurity, supporting many initiatives, in particular with United Nations and ITU on this topic, where I'm very passionate. So here I am to contribute to this great discussion. Thank you, Nick.
And thank you. It's this is just going to be so fascinating. And just by order of people I see on my screen, Sam, would you care to go next for me?
Yes, thank you, Nick. Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Sam Visner. I'm honored, by the way, to be here today, and I thank the International Telecommunications Union for inviting me. Thank you very much. I am, as I said, Sam Visner. I'm the director of the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center in the United States. My company, MITRE, which is a nonprofit corporation, manages the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm also a professor of cybersecurity policy, operations, and technology at Georgetown University. I've served in the US government, in the Department of Defense, and I've also managed a couple of cybersecurity businesses. So I've been in government, I've been in the private sector, and now in the nonprofit sector, working cybersecurity for several decades. So again, thank you, Nick, and thank you, ITU, for inviting me.
And thank you, thank you. And as you mentioned when we first met, organizing this, it's great to have the band back together. It's good to see you again. Thank you very much. And somebody that I just met recently, and also next on my screen would be Chris. Chris, can you please introduce yourself as well?
So, thank you. Again, Chris Gibson. I am the Executive Director of FIRST, which is the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. Been in this game probably 20 plus years, a bit like Sam. Very similar to Sam, I started in the private sector. I spent 3 years, I built and ran CERT UK, the UK's first formally chartered national incident response team. So very focused on building that to fix and to comply with the National Cybersecurity Strategy that the UK had at the time. I've then moved on a little bit and spent some time working as a CISO, and now I'm in the non-profit sector in FIRST. So I'm all about building collaboration, coordination across the world amongst incident response teams. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thanks for being here as well. And I appreciate it. So the next one up, Agvile, and I believe I am pronouncing that correctly. If not, please correct me. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning, everybody. You pronounce it very well. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
So my name is Agvile Giniotiene. I'm head of Cyber and New Technology Unit at the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, United Nations Counterterrorist Center. I recently joined it this year. Prior to that, I worked for 5 years in the private sector as an international consultant, helping countries around the world to develop national cybersecurity strategies. I worked in Southeast Asia, in Europe, in South America, in Africa. And before that, I worked for the government almost 20 years in different capacities, mostly in national security sector. I had a successful career in the military. So that's my background, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very interesting and relevant discussion.
And thank you for being here. And I think it will be both interesting and relevant, as you say, just given the landscape today. With that, Irfan, are you here as well?
Myself, so I'm Irfan Hemani. I currently work for the UK government in our Ministry of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, where I am head of the team that looks at the drafting of the new cybersecurity strategy, along with our international work and skills policy. I started my career in the private sector, actually at Deloitte, like one of my co-panelists, where I worked on information security and technology, largely after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the early 2000s, kind of security and technology auditing and monitoring to the front. So I started my career in the area around 15, 16 years ago, and have done various things since then. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Irfan. And also next up would be Pratima. Pratima, are you here?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nick. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Pratima Pradhan, and I work as a senior ICT officer at Bhutan CERT. It's Computer Incident Response Team, not Emergency Response Team. I've been working with the government of Bhutan for past 8 years, and I have joined BT CERT only in the beginning of this year. That's because I completed master's degree in cybersecurity last year in 2019. Before joining BTCert, I was working with a division that takes care of application development and management. At present, I look after the development and implementation of National Cybersecurity Strategy. I would like to thank ITU for giving BTCert this opportunity to share our experiences. And I would also like to thank on my behalf for the privilege given to me among the experts. Thank you.
And thank you, and thank you. And just as a quick reminder to our panelists, because we have interpretation going on, I should have mentioned this in the housekeeping, let's make sure that we are not speaking as fast. That will be my problem, as I am usually a quick talker, and I have a radio show and there's no dead air. So by virtue of that, thank you all. We will eventually be joined by Martin Koyabi as well of the Commonwealth Telecommunication Organization. And at that point, Martin, I would love for you to introduce yourself, but I'd love to dive in to the basically to the questions right now. And I'm actually going to start where I started the introductions with Andrea. And I think this is actually a really good place to start, because there has been a proliferation of national cybersecurity strategies worldwide. And according to the ITU repository, more than 110 countries, have adopted a national cybersecurity strategy. Doreen also mentioned that as well. Now, given the overall rise of cybersecurity development as a public policy phenomenon, what countries, or rather, why should countries, or why do countries start creating national cybersecurity strategies?
So it looks like if you don't have a cybersecurity strategy, you are not dealing seriously with the phenomenon or with the topic. And from a certain perspective, this is true. I mean, and we need to clarify what a strategy is. Strategy is not a document where you just describe your high-level objectives. Strategy is your real strategy, what you intend to do as a country, as a government, to protect your national interest, being economic, the economic development of the country, protecting the business, protecting the citizens, the freedom of the citizens. A strategy can also be not public. Some countries decided to have a strategy and simply they decided not to have a visible strategy, something that can be read and commented by other countries. But even those countries, they have a very specific strategy. So that's the first reason why this is gaining popularity. There are also some initiatives globally that are asking governments to become vocal about their strategies, in particular, looking at indexes to understand what a country is doing on cybersecurity. One of the first questions that governments are asked to respond is, do you have a strategy? Now, I would make a distinction between the strategy with a small s and the strategy with a capital S. That means not just a document where you talk about the importance of protecting critical infrastructure, where you state that international cooperation is important, blah, blah, blah. Of course, this is a good first step. From the strategy with a capital S, that is how a government is going to play its fundamental role in orchestrating the protection of the national interest in cyberspace.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too, in the sense of quantifying exactly what a strategy should be, for a country. It's a huge, huge problem, and I think we've all seen organizations, even at the national level, that basically might have something written down but not necessarily executed upon. And while it's great on paper, it really doesn't help us when we're under threat. And so, by virtue of that, I think when we're talking about strategies, and Chris, I'm going to pivot to you real quick. What are the most important goals to be basically included at the strategic and policy level to ensure a country's readiness, resilience, and capability to recover, as well as obviously quickly restore services after they have some kind of incident? And just given your relationship and your work with FIRST, I think that's a really good question to ask you.
Sure. So I guess the first thing to think about when you're creating a strategy, and I was involved on the sidelines in the creation of the present UK strategy, is really making sure you join all the dots right across both government, but private sector, academia, and so on. This is not something government can solve on its own. It's not something private sector can solve on its own, but you need, that strategy needs to encompass both of those to work out how to improve the life, how to improve your resilience going forward, and how to make your country a more resilient space for cyber security, for cyber and so on. Measuring it is difficult. We've all had this challenge for years, and in all aspects of cybersecurity. It's always been a challenge to prove whether you're doing a good job. If you see more incidents, is that because you're better at detecting them, or because you're more vulnerable? If you fix more incidents more quickly, is that because you're not seeing the difficult incidents, you're only looking at the easy ones? So it's always been a challenge. There was one of the measures that I've heard used when I was in the civil service in the UK, was it was sort of a, it's almost an intangible. Is there someone with a grip on this? Is there some one person or one area that actually sees the whole picture and can get that together and understand that and report that up the line? So when you have a major incident, are 10 different bits of government running around in 10 different directions to do stuff? Because if they are, that's really bad. What you need is that coherent, solid strategy that everybody understands how they play in this, how they work on this, how they interact together. But I think, to be fair, more importantly, how do you get that single view of what's going on? Single point of truth, single statement of truth going up the ladder into senior management. You could call it, senior politicians, whatever, so that they can understand this. There's also, how do you measure? How do you push that into public sector and private sector? So, if you go to someone, and this was a comment that was made by the head of the Bank of England at the time, he said he didn't know who to go to when there was a cyber incident. Does he go to law enforcement? Does he go to the intelligence services in the UK? Does he go to CERT? Does he go to his private one? There are too many moving parts. That is a challenge in our world. But a good cyber strategy will bring those all together into quite a simple, coherent state that everybody can understand and work with.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think what it essentially brings up, the point that you're making right here, I think really leads into the gap analysis, that we all essentially have to do at a national level, to make sure that we do know who we should be calling, that we do have those contingency plans in place, and everything else. Just also FYI, on a complete aside, just an audience member had requested, in terms of interpretation and translation, that we should all slow down. Myself, I am the most guilty of that. There is no doubt of that. But just as a quick reminder, but to stay on gaps, Sam, just real quick, what gaps exist in international cyber governance, and how implementing monitoring and evaluation mechanisms at the strategic level can help governments basically filling these gaps and understanding their own gap analysis?
Nick, thank you for that question. And as you know, I live in Washington, D.C. So having thanked you for that question, I'm first going to answer a different question, and then I'll come back to that question.
Please.
I want people to distinguish carefully between policy and strategy. A policy is what a country intends to do, what interests it intends to pursue. A strategy is how that is done. And one thing I urge every country to have is a policy and strategy architecture. The group of stakeholders from government, from industry, from academia, from nonprofits, from every sector, who help define and understand what the country's policy will be, with some guidance from the country's leadership. That has to be translated to a strategy architecture, which is how one achieves the policy. And that strategy architecture has two great values. The first is that it provides a mechanism for broad representation from all the sectors that are involved. And secondly, it also couples the strategy to the resources, capabilities, and responsibilities of each sector and each stakeholder, because cybersecurity is a whole of nation problem. It includes government, it includes critical infrastructure, it includes manufacturing, it includes the private sector, it includes the economy, it includes civil society. So it is important to have an architecture that provides a means for not only their representation, but for each of them understanding and implementing their role. In terms of international governance, there are several problems. One problem, I think, is the overall lack of a common framework for planning. And I think a common framework for planning is something which, if all countries shared, would make it easier, A, for countries to understand what each other is doing, and B, for countries to work together. So such a framework like cybercrime prevention and prosecution, incident response, resilient operations, risk management and resourcing, policy and standards, civil law, regulation, accountability, public awareness, and a culture of cybersecurity, and a cybersecurity workforce, if that or another framework, though that I think is a very good framework, were shared by countries, it would provide better international governance and better international cooperation. My last point is this: we need better international transparency. We need international mechanisms to identify if countries or criminal groups are developing offensive capabilities and testing them and using them, such that countries can be held more to account. I look for an example at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, which built an international monitoring capability that allows for the detection of nuclear weapons testing and development. And it not only does a good job technically, in my opinion, but it also does a good job from an international governance perspective. So over time, moving to some shared understanding of how to detect illicit cyber activities and to hold particularly cyber criminals to account, I think is something that ought to be done. And I do think there have been useful steps in this direction. I would urge that more attention be given to them. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, thank you. And I think what you're saying really underscores the need to have that collaborative, international, basically coalition that is essentially going to come together and really tackle this problem, which I think is just a huge issue that the entire globe has. And with that, I'm going to pivot to Akvile real quick, because the global outreach of, or rather the global reach of cyber criminals, there's no real single national law enforcement apparatus that can legally pursue malicious actors, even though we have things like Interpol and some others. What are the existing international regional channels to bring together law enforcement, private industry, and academia to build and share those resources, things like strategic information and threat intelligence, to essentially identify and counter cyber criminals? What are the typical minimum requirements, do you think, for basically a country to essentially engage and build partnerships in this manner?
Thank you, Nick, for this question. Regarding international collaboration, so everything starts at the national level. So countries' engagement in international collaboration is defined by its policy, strategic approach. So internationally, as you mentioned, Interpol and Europol are those channels that information regarding cybercrime activities can be exchanged. Joint investigations could be conducted. So in terms, there are different initiatives to bring private sector together. There's a global forum, counter-terrorist forum, where industry comes together to look at the terrorist activities online and look for the solutions how to counter that. There are efforts to help member states to exchange information in prosecuting criminal offenses and counterterrorism offenses. So one of those initiatives was a joint counterterrorism executive directorate and UNODC publication on practical guide for requests of electronic evidence from internet service providers and in different jurisdictions, because we see this is a problem when you need information from Facebook, from Amazon to prosecute crimes and cyber crimes. So this guide helps member states to approach that in a more effective manner, know how to request information, request the evidence that is outside the jurisdiction. So these are the efforts internationally. And of course, there are various initiatives and in terms of collaborations of incident response team at first, and bilateral cooperation that is happening, but more effort is needed in that regard, and ways to explore how to make this cooperation more effective is also needed. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, thank you. And I think that's a really good point, especially when we're talking about the massive online platforms that the world simply seems to use, like Facebook. You know, outside of cyber crime, we've simply seen issues with this on the privacy side. Europe, for example, has the GDPR. The United States doesn't have anything like that. You know, which makes obviously a disparity in law, which I think obviously translates, as you say, into into the cybercrime side of things. But I think this is actually a really good place to pivot to Martin Koyabe with the Commonwealth Telecommunication Organization, because obviously the Commonwealth is a rather large organization across the globe. And Martin, if you could please introduce yourself, I'd appreciate it. And then I've got a question for you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and also for the panelists who have just come before me. My name is Martin Koyabe. I work for the Commonwealth Telecommunication Organization. My main role is to look at the technical support and consultancy across the 54 or 53 countries, depending on who is in or who is out. And we do look at issues ICT related. And so far, in relation to this particular webinar, we've been looking at cybersecurity, cybercrime, and cyber standards across some of these 54 nations. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you, and welcome. Because obviously the Commonwealth countries, as you say, there's quite a few of them, but like other countries, they have a need for implementing a national cybersecurity strategy. However, being a Commonwealth country can also pose some unique challenges. Can you tell us about your experience with national cybersecurity strategies in this vein?
Yeah, thanks for that again. And I know there are people on this panel who might have had experience with some of the countries that I mentioned.
Hi.
But coming back to the point, I think I agree with Andrea and Sam. And
can I do it in about?
Sorry, I agree with the other panelists when they talked about what a strategy is. And I think Sam put it very clearly. It's the actions that you take. I look at it as a map that says, okay, you're going from point A to B. What do you want to achieve along the way? And are you going to stop? Are you going to have some fuel? So you plan what you're going to do along the way. And in simple terms, there are very many challenges that many of these countries do face, but I'll just go through them in the short time that I have. One is the issue around, as pointed out earlier, the support within the national support for having a strategy. This is very, very important because the multi-stakeholder partnership that has been evangelized all along is a very important component to make sure that you have support from different sectors, as put up by one of the panelists. So therefore, the support by the government to make sure that you have a cybersecurity strategy is a very important aspect of it. And when you have a strategy, as Andrea said, the strategy is the action, it's the people, it's what you do. But the point is that we've reached a point where you have a document, which is a strategic document, but you don't know what to do in the next step. So one challenge has always been, what is the priority? How do you prioritize the actions that you need to take that have been identified in the strategy? And prior to that, there's also the issue around gaps that you've identified. So there has to be a process of how you identify the gaps. And we've seen efforts from the likes of the CMM model, which has been used in a number of countries to make sure that you can be able to identify gaps in a strategy and then be able to implement them. So the issue around having a strategy and how you go from a strategy to the implementation is also a very tricky aspect. So we need to think about prioritization. That's number one. The second issue also is the issue around the sustaining and how do you fund those tasks that have been identified. Many of the countries that we've dealt with have that particular problem of the funding, which is never discussed during the formulation of a strategy. We never call in the finance office, or we never call in the finance ministry, but we call them after a strategy has already been put in place. So therefore, the funding is a big, big issue that needs to be considered. But moving forward, we are now seeing another trend that also is helping this particular process, whereby donor agencies, funding agencies, developing partners, the private sector are trying to come together before advancing their assistance in whichever shape or form to these countries. And we've seen that through the Global Forum for Cyber Experts. That's another forum, that the GFCE forum is a good forum, because what it does is that it puts all these people together in order to prioritize how to approach a specific problem that has been identified in some of the developing countries. But I think there's no doubt we have challenges, especially in a number of areas in these developing countries. One is the area of legal, the issues of policy and regulation. That is a challenge that needs to be addressed. We have challenges when it comes to capacity development, how much capacity, the understanding of cybersecurity as an issue. That's another challenge. We have a challenge in terms of just the resilience, which again, the panelists talked about, Chris talked about it a little bit earlier, but the resilience of this particular infrastructure in these countries, that is something that needs to be looked at. And then of course, cooperation, both regionally, nationally, and internationally, as talked about by our colleague there. That is another issue that needs to be looked at. And of course, the financial aspect. How do you sustain? How do you make sure that these strategies are implemented? And how do we monitor and evaluate them? So those are the challenges that are there. But again, as we've said earlier, efforts such as the one that the ITU has put forward, where consortiums and organizations with experience come together to come up with a guide, can be a good contribution, and it is a good contribution towards guiding some of these countries to understand what sort of areas to look at, what sort of issues to prioritize, and how to go about them, which is very, very important. Back to you, Nick. Thank you.
And thank you. And thank you. And I think that's an excellent answer. And I think it really all comes back to what Sam was talking about regarding that gap analysis that I think all countries, developing or otherwise, really have to face. And I think one of the other issues that we are going to have with this, I think, is trust and confidence, in implementing as well, or implementation as well. And so, Irfan, I'm going to turn to you on this, because it's been reported that only 34% of managers actually have confidence in their team's ability to detect and respond to cyber threats. Now, this is due essentially to a general shortage of cybersecurity skills and professionals globally. I know we have that problem here in the United States. For example, 69% of managers state that their team are essentially understaffed, and almost half of them have said that university graduates in cybersecurity are not prepared for the job challenges that they're going to face. I've actually seen that firsthand with some of my work that I've done here with universities. Now, what is the role of basically national CIRTs in addressing this gap? What are the essential skills and knowledge an incident response team must have, and how can these be developed, just anywhere on the globe?
So Nick, thank you for asking those questions. I think they're really important, and they get to the crux of the issue. I think we can talk a lot about the different parts of cybersecurity. The governance is important, international cooperation is important. I think when it comes down to it, as you and others will know, the work is done by people. Even when you are talking about technology or smart technologies or AI in the defense of the digital economy, they're put together by people. So I really can't stress enough how crucial skills are to a secure digital economy. Now, you mentioned a few gaps there. In the UK, we have a similar kind of level of confidence in the ability of people that are training for these jobs, but also that just the size of the gap. So in the UK, we had something like 650,000 businesses that stated that they had a cybersecurity gap, and we have 120,000 cybersecurity posts that are difficult to fill. Now, it's amazing to think that that's the case when there is, an economy in the state that it is in, and this was similar 10 years ago when we were also in a downturn. So we really need to think about why is it that these jobs, which are high quality, high paying jobs, aren't attracting people into them. I think there's a few things here. You mentioned the role of CSERT in the skills training of people into this profession. I think it's broader than that. And we were talking, and a few people mentioned the importance of strategy. And Dr. Kayabi mentioned it just now, and it was spoken about right at the start, that strategy is a piece of paper that sits on a shelf. So the strategy is really there about it's to get the various, one of the things it does is it brings various stakeholders together. The CSERTs are one of those, industry is another, the training sector is another, and the education sector is another. And what a strategy can really do is bring those different strands together to actually, get the desired result. I think one of the issues that we see in the cyber skills sector is that it's really hard to navigate for businesses and for trainees and for employees. It's, there's no single standard of what level you get to after a few years of training. And I think the massive need over the last 15 years for cyber skills has led to a plethora of qualifications that it's difficult to navigate how to go from one to the other to the other. And so actually putting together a pathway for the cyber career and the cyber sector is really important in allowing people to navigate those jobs. So there's also, and I touched on this earlier, how do you get more people thinking that cyber is a sector that they want to be in? I think the majority of, or many people, look at the sector and say it's very technical, it's for a certain demographic or a certain profile of person, and that's not me. Actually, those of us that have worked in cyber have seen a whole range of different people with different backgrounds working there. So, one is to make sure we get enough people into that talent pool to start with. Another one is to make sure that talent pool knows where to go after the training. And then another one is to actually have the standards to make sure that what people are being trained on is the right thing.
Yeah, and I think those are all really good points. In that sense that we do have a limited pool in cybersecurity of those that are, I think, very interested in going into the field. But to your greater point, though, as we are training and developing, these individuals and putting them out into the workforce, whether it's the private or the public sector, I think it really might scream, or rather really might underscore the need for organizational structure. And so, Sam, I'd like to know your thoughts on this, but what organizational structure or structures like bodies, agencies, et cetera, should countries be putting into place to ensure that their national cybersecurity strategy, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, and everything else is constructively performed? Obviously, if we have a bit of a gap, if you will, in, let's say, the education, the training, and the experience of generation of cybersecurity professionals coming out of college or university and going into the workforce, that obviously we need to make sure that we are properly channeling them to ensure that we are ensuring our national cybersecurity strategies.
Nick, thank you. That is an excellent question. In my view, one of the big gaps we have in strategy is accountability for what we do. Not only does the strategy say we will do something, but it also says who will do it and with what resources and when it will be done. And if possible, what metrics will be used to determine if it has been done and if additional actions and additional resources are necessary to accomplish that part of the strategy. In terms of workforce development, I think this is a national issue. And it's a national issue both to develop people, to help people find the right opportunities, to sustain an educational process that continues to develop people, and that develops people not just for technology, but for operations and for the continued development of policy and strategy. In the US, we have a program called the National Initiative for Cyber Education, or NICE, which is an effort, one that continues to evolve, that provides for national government guidance, but also is implemented at the state and the local level. I'm not saying that this is the model that every other country should use. What I am saying, however, is that particularly in workforce development, it's important that we develop people, but also make sure they have some place to work. I think Chris made that point, that we have a gap of people and yet we're not necessarily finding them the right work. And at the same time, we also have to make sure that people have current skills, that if we move to cloud, if we move to 5G, if we move to IoT, if we move to smart cities and smart infrastructure, that we understand the challenges of securing these new systems and technologies and infrastructures, and we continue in our workforce development efforts to ensure that people understand those challenges and have the right skills. So I would say that overall, there is uneven development around the world in cyber workforce development in particular, and in coupling that development to a country's national cyber policy and national cyber strategy. And strategy, if it assigns resources and responsibility and timelines and metrics, can help close that gap.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, just in terms of developing that national cybersecurity. And we actually have, I think, something that kind of dovetails with that rather well. A question from the audience. Vanessa from Brazil asks, metrics are an essential component of the strategies. Can you share good practices of metrics that you have identified in national strategies? And I'm thinking, Agvile, just given your background, you might be a good one to answer that question for us.
Well, this is a really tricky question regarding the metrics. And as Chris mentioned at the beginning, so what are we measuring? And are we looking at the number? Because metrics need to be measurable, first of all. So are we looking at the number of cyber incidents? And if we have them more of cyber incidents, does it mean that we are better at our ability to detect them? Or does it mean that our strategy is not working? So, and this is also a big question at the UN, where we manage our UN Global Counterterrorist Program on Cyber and New Technologies, which assists our member states in building capacities in 3 particular areas. So, and the question is always there. So how we measure the success of our capacity building programs, and it can be applied the same to national cybersecurity strategies. What are the good metrics to see that? So first, of course, when developing metrics, one has to think about what they are trying to achieve in terms of policy and cybersecurity strategy and how to measure that. So number of cyber incidents could be a metric, but what does it show? Does it show that we are better at detecting them, or does it show that our strategy is not working, and or the international environment is getting more and more toxic, and nations are not capable to do that? I was thinking about how to measure, for example, the effectiveness of law enforcement in prosecuting cybercrime. So one of the metrics that could be used is to compare the actual cases that have been started to investigate cybercrime and actual prosecution, number of prosecutions, successful prosecutions of those cases, because in this regard, it can show that we started the investigation and we were able to prosecute it, bring it to court. Evidence was submitted and was acceptable. So we have good electronic evidence collection capabilities, digital forensic capabilities, maybe sharing of information between incident response teams and cybercrime units. That also helped. So that could be a metric to do. In some cases, for example, certain elements of national cybersecurity strategy are important, like having whole of the government exercises, for example. So the metric could be, the number of exercises held and the number of lessons identified. This could also help to achieve a nation better preparedness and better resilience, because cyber exercises, they bring stakeholders together at the same table to run different scenarios, and that could be a good metric. But actually, the metrics are tricky and it's difficult to develop. There are some good practices available how to develop them, and one that I'm aware of is ENISA's guide to development of cybersecurity strategies. But I cannot give a very definite and clear answer what is a good metric. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, and it's very interesting. And Andrea actually just posted in chat as a response to Vanessa as well, and his last statement as something that we should be essentially joining forces on as an international community to, I think, create those standards is something that is, that's very important as well. And Chris, I just saw you, chimed in as well. But I think, though, this actually dovetails when we are talking about resilience and all of that. And Andrea, I'd love for you to answer this question, kind of in that vein, just picking up where Vanessa's question left off, because in order for a national cybersecurity strategy to essentially add value to the development of national cybersecurity strength and resilience, it's essential to elaborate a roadmap for its implementation. We've talked about the gap analysis and all of that. At some point, we start planning for the implementation. And so what are some of the most important elements in terms of responsibilities, priorities, requirements, et cetera, to be taken into account when elaborating on that implementation plan?
So we go back to some business points. I mean, it was very clear before saying, you have the policy, you have the strategy, but then, the most important thing is how you translate those principles and actions into reality. So first of all, a great metric to measure, a strategy is, do you have a plan? And is that plan clear enough? I mean, identifying which are the actors involved, the timelines, the budgets, and talking about actors and capabilities, if there's a clear identification of the stakeholders. I think that national cybersecurity, or cybersecurity in general, because it's very difficult, to create a national boundary around cybersecurity, is like a complex biological system. Is not protecting the system from viruses. We get in contact with viruses every day, and we have an immune system that should be responding to that. And it's the same for nationals or in general, cybersecurity related to national interests. You need to allow a flourish economy. You need to allow digital services to be as interoperable as possible, but at the same way, protecting them. The most difficult, now without using medical examples, because I'm not a doctor, I understand a little bit of music, is like having, the government should be playing the role of an orchestrator. First, in order to orchestrate, you need a group of musicians, a group of players. And the players are not only the government agencies. Every time we are asked by a government to come and support, we find out that the government, most of the times, they don't have a dialogue, an intense dialogue with the private sector owners. And most of the times, they manage, and they deliver the national digital service or the national essential services. So first is recognizing the players. Second, there are players that are not national. I mean, what's the influence to national security of big global players like the social media or the new media platforms? I mean, they are becoming closer and closer to an international organization or a government with its own governance, and they need to be recognized as somehow relevant stakeholders. Third, you need to have a score. Okay, I have this beautiful group of talented musicians, and then what we're going to do? That's the plan, but the plan, needs to be based on the music you want to hear. And that's how, at the end, you will judge the execution. You know, those are the metrics. Now, I suspect, it's more than a suspect. I'm sure that most of the metrics I've seen are very tactical. It's like measuring cholesterol. Are we sure? Do we have real evidence that high cholesterol will lead to death? So there are some behaviors, some practices that we think might help national security, but we don't know yet. That's where, in my written comment in the chat, I'm suggesting that we need common frameworks because we need to merge those compliance-based, old-fashioned metrics approaches to the new approaches that are based on massive data, artificial intelligence. Let me see, what I observe in real cybersecurity and compare it, with the final results. That's where we need international projects where we can provide a safe and secure environment that will not threaten, freedom of speech and privacy and personal security, but on the other side will help us as governments, to improve. Let me just finish with the last comment. It's true that every government has a different strategy, but if you look at most of the strategies, and for the work I do, I very often end up doing benchmarks, comparing the different strategies. 95% of the objectives are exactly the same. Sometimes there are very relevant differences, but let's forget those differences. Let's work together on the common objectives. That's where governments might work together to find common solutions.
Yeah, and I think that just really underscores, and I love your analogy of the musicians, because it takes all of us working together to make a concert, and so I think that's a really good point. Now, Martin, I know you wanted to jump in here real quick for a minute or two and add your thoughts onto that particular question. So Martin, if you would.
Yeah,
please.
thank you, Nick. I was just listening to Andrea very carefully, and I know Andrea means well. It is true, you need data in order to know where you are. But let me just take you 2 steps back. It also depends on the stage of the country. If a country, for example, is at this initial stages, and we are calling it this ground zero, no strategy available, only policy, or even none of those, then I think the buildup is dependent on what you would consider the core factors. So for example, you would advise a country that, look, you've got to look at your instruments of law. You've got to look at your policies. You've got to look at the regulation in order to allow you to have a strategy that has a focal point. Because if you don't have a mandate as an agency, you can't even start formulating that strategy in the first place. So the priorities are dependent on the stage of the country where it is. And if there's more data to go by, then you could use that data to fall back to that data to give you the measure of the priorities that are required. So for example, if a country wants to have a SAT as a measure to make sure that they can be able to protect its infrastructure, then that could also get a priority. It could be prioritized based on the impact that SAT will have if something else went wrong. So therefore, the issue about the risks and the value of that risk if things go wrong could also help and shape how you determine the priorities. But some of them are very, very much interlinked because they are more or less related to the legislation, to the policies that are in place, and even the mandate of the agencies that are supposed to conduct that. So I just wanted to bring that perspective to point. It depends on the stage and the information that you have moving forward in terms of prioritization. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously a really good point, because some countries are going to have a massive amount of data collection, others are not. We have an entire path that we take from basics all the way to maturity that essentially I think is going to dictate where a country is. And I think this is actually a really good time to talk to Pratima of Bhutan as well, because I think her country Bhutan is going along this path right now. And so Pratima, I'd love to know what have been some of the main challenges that your country has encountered while developing its national cybersecurity strategy, and what mechanisms has your country put into place to ensure that the national cybersecurity strategy implementation is going to be successful?
Thank you so much for the question. Actually, the challenges that we have faced and still we are facing are almost answered by all the panelists. So thank you so much to all the panelists. I'm enjoying the talk. To begin my answer, let me just explain you about my country, Bhutan, because I think most of the participants in this virtual room may not have heard about Bhutan or may not have known about Bhutan at all. So Bhutan is a small landlocked country and squeezed between China and India. And we have a population merely 700,000 people. We'll be soon graduating from the least developed country to a developing country, and a lot of credit goes to ITU. Thank you. ICT was introduced 2 decades ago, and so far we have progressed so much in ICT adoption. Like in terms of mobile banking, we have cardless transactions. Number of 3G and 4G network mobile subscriptions has increased a lot, which almost equals to the size of our population. Most government services are offered online. Their hydropower sector is one of the highest economic generating sector of our country, and they are also adopting high-end operation technologies like SCADA. And even because of the pandemic, most of the health and education services are also transitioning into online digital platform. BTCERT, Bhutan Computer Incident Response Team, was established 4.5 years ago in 2016. And the cybersecurity journey began with the readiness assessment conducted by ITU in 2012. BTCERT, we function under the Department of IT and Telecom within the government of Bhutan. And we are mandated to provide both the reactive as well as proactive cybersecurity services to the entire nation. The initiation of the development of cybersecurity strategy, it happened towards the end of 2018 through ITU support. Dr. Marco Gerg visited the country and provided us a rough NCS draft, initial draft. However, the first draft of NCS, the actual finalization of the NCS was been able to complete only this year, a few months ago. So we are, at the moment, we are awaiting public consultation. And after that, the NCS, National Cybersecurity Strategy document will be submitted to the Cabinet of Bhutan for the approval. So as the year gap demonstrates, we did face quite a number of challenges in the process. Among many other difficulties, the most difficult were on explaining the importance of cybersecurity and the necessity of cybersecurity strategy. Like our leaders, mostly they are non-IT background, and in a country where adoption of ICT is a work in progress, educating cybersecurity is another bigger challenge. Senior management perceive that the cybersecurity is a problem with technology when it is actually more than that. The other challenge was the support and buy-in from stakeholders. NCS caters to all sectors, in fact, to the entire country, and for NCS to come as a comprehensive and inclusive, we needed involvement and collaboration from all sectors. It was challenging in the beginning to bring everyone on board. First problem. The second was also very difficult to come into one consensus. The other main challenge was because being us very small country, and also we are very young democracy, we have limited cybersecurity capacity and capability. So within the country, we have very few. We can count in our fingers. We have very few number of cybersecurity professionals, and NCS requires a lead who has a complete understanding of the entire ICT ecosystem. So in the start, there were difficulties in getting a clear direction of the strategy, like prioritization of activities. Being inexperienced, we felt all the domains of cybersecurity were important, because there were cases, cybersecurity incidents were happening. The awareness was another domain, and then technical development of technical skills was the other. So there was lots of confusion in the beginning. Coming back to your part 2, the second question, we also feel that we have come a long way. So we are hoping that once the NCS document gets approved by the cabinet, we feel that implementation would be smoothly, though it's easier said than done. Because we already have a high-level ICT steering committee, which is composed of top-level management from both the public and private sector. And that committee is chaired by the Prime Minister of Bhutan. So our plan is that the implementation of NCS will be stayed by this body. We have also secured budget roughly around 7 million USD, which is less. But if we convert it, the equivalent is near term 50 million. That budget is for identifying critical information infrastructure. We haven't done at the moment, so that's in the plan. The budget is also for conducting cybersecurity awareness and also in developing capacity and capability within the country. The other, we are trying to ensure that the strategy will be successful because we have identified the stakeholders and their responsibilities. Now in the plan, we have identified a creation of 3 groups. The legal group will be composed of stakeholders from LEA, law enforcement agencies, who will be looking after the cybersecurity legislation of Bhutan. The other group is a Child Online Protection Group, will be composed of education sector, ISPs, and CSOs. So they will come up with the COP guidelines. And the third group is the technical group, which will be composed of people from the experts, mostly technical experts from the critical sectors, as well as from academia and other technical experts. So the first task that we have identified for now is the development of baseline security, specific to CII agencies, as well as other non-CII agencies and SME, small and medium enterprises. So other monitoring will be, the plan is the monitoring of NCS implementation will be conducted by PTCERT monthly. And if any issue arises, that will be escalated to the high-level steering committee. So we feel that we are really hoping high that once the NCS gets approved, we will kickstart with the implementation by formation of this group. So that's all that I have to say for now. We haven't implemented, so I think more lessons will be learned once we start implementing. So that's all for now. Thank you.
And thank you, and thank you. And I think that's just a really interesting insight, Pratima, into Bhutan and where they're at, and also, you know, lessons that you learn, right, as you develop the strategy and you begin that implementation process. And I think that actually really dovetails rather well with a question from the audience, just overall in general, regarding essentially motivation and encouragement. And Chris, I think just given your background in FIRST, I think this would be really interesting to hear your response to. Thanks again, Pratima. But the question from Adi from the audience is, one of the most important things explained in the discussion was how to encourage the involvement of all stakeholders, government, private sector, et cetera, to implement a defined strategy. Can you explain, Chris, how the best way to foster engagement for all of these stakeholders is?
That's a really, really good question. And I'll try and explain it both from sort of a FIRST point of view and from some of my previous experience. So FIRST believes in is always all about collaboration and helping people build a better world, but that requires people to have bought in the first place. So we're already talking about people who want to do good stuff, and now they're joining an organization that allows them to talk to other people with a similar mindset and with a similar desire to improve things. I think as we look at this in a national CSIRT realm, where you're in a country and you're trying to encourage academia and private business and government and civil society and so on to do the same thing, that's a very different space, and it's something the UK government has wrestled with over the years. I'm sure Irfan will jump in on this at some point. when I was part of that world, which is, I think I left that world about 4 years ago, originally we had tried very much on the, let's encourage people to do good things. Let's build an environment where they can join. Let's build an environment they can share information, but we're very much sort of using a carrot less and not so much of a stick. There was a big theory that, or a big, worry that if we regulated things, it would become a sort of a tick box environment. Have you got a firewall? Yes. Well, having a firewall doesn't make you secure. It just means you've got a box. If it's configured correctly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that makes you secure. So for a long time, there was this, well, we can't regulate, but we will encourage through national things. And there was a lot of work done on helping businesses see an improvement to their bottom line. So cyber insurance. So, being able to insure some of your losses. If the company was good, it should get cheaper insurance. Therefore, there's a bottom line hit to that company's profitability, which hopefully incentivizes them to do things. Similar things with, say, bank loans. If you're a very good cyber company, maybe you get a cheaper bank loan. Your money is, that loan is more safe and so on. That's a very niche area to work in. It doesn't really help in a lot of areas. I look at lots of sectors in the UK where, the medical sector, our National Health Service, hugely important, hugely amazing gang of people. If you give a doctor £1 million, is he going to buy an MRI scanner, or is he going to buy more cybersecurity stuff to keep people safe? That's a real challenge to work through, and I get that that's difficult. So for a long time, we held off using any form of stick on this. Just as towards the end of my time in government, the GDPR sort of hove into view. British government, obviously part of the EU at the time, was very interested in how that worked. And we saw that as a very natural way to encourage people to do better, because it actually meant that if they did badly, then there were punishments, there were fines, there were hits to bottom lines, etc. And it also put the power sort of back where it should be, which is the British government's view is it's a business's problem to be cyber secure and run a secure business and be resilient and be cyber safe and whatever. And if they're not, then the customer should move and go somewhere else. So again, you're trying to drive that bottom line figure. That works quite well in business. I still, it's still a challenge in say the National Health Service. It's still a challenge in charity sectors and so on. But it is very difficult to encourage people to do this properly. But there has been a bit of a sea change away from that. Let's just hope people are going to be good into actually we're going to start forcing them. We're going to start driving them to be good through the regulation side of the world, but very much based on best practices, very much based on, common standards and so on, rather than you should have a firewall. You should be resilient or you should be secure to the level that everybody would expect. And if you can't prove that, then we'll give you a bigger fine. BA just got fined for, some issues they had a couple of years ago. They were one of the first to be hit with a reasonably big fine. It was a £20 million fine. So that some of those are coming through. It certainly was something that when I worked in the private sector, it focused the board's view very closely. The thought that they could lose 4% of their global turnover potentially makes a board certainly think about cybersecurity. But again, that's very focused on private sector, companies with businesses and so on. How do you encourage society to be more secure is a real challenge. We tried to do that by lots of awareness, lots of explanations, lots of collaboration, sharing, and help, and changing what was the previous perception of government was that government was only interested in taking information from the private sector about cyber stuff. When we built CERT, our model was that unless we couldn't, we would always share back with the private sector. So trying to genuinely build a partnership with the private sector rather than just being a receptacle of information. So building that trust through working together, I think, was the other piece.
Yeah, and I actually think that's a really good point, because in this day and age, data really can't move one way, especially when we're talking about things like threat intelligence. And I also can't tell you how many times I've walked into, including massive organizations that say, well, we've got an antivirus and a firewall. We do cybersecurity. It's a very common misconception, I think, the world over, and it's something that really needs to be addressed. But Sam, I want to ask you this question though, because I think just to expand on what Chris was talking about here, what is the added value of engaging society in the implementation of a national security strategy, and how can this engagement, and obviously future ones as well, be more inclusive, more collaborative in terms of needs, orientations, and perspectives from essentially a wide variety of cybersecurity stakeholders, both public and private?
Thank you, Nick, for that question. There are several things that can be done and several advantages that can be gained. First, there is a need to engage all of society. If people don't practice good cybersecurity individually, and if they don't have good knowledge about what to do, why to do it, and why it is important, it may not happen. There is a discouraging set of anecdotes. And as we say, the plural of anecdote does not equal data. But in this case, perhaps it does, that a lot of old exploits continue to work because people don't take enough care, and the organizations for which they don't work don't take enough care. We've seen some ransomware attacks against cities using ransomware that has been around for a long time, and yet it continues to work, even though mitigation is possible. So good education among stakeholders at the enterprise level, the government level, the corporate level, the individual working unit level, and the individual level, I think is important. This is another reason why I think metrics can be important, because when people say, so what? So there's a problem. Does it really affect my company? Does it really affect my government ministry? The answer is yes, and here's the evidence. We talked earlier about metrics. There are generally two kinds. Inputs, and Chris Gibson, you mentioned one, do we have a firewall? These are inputs, what we are doing. The other are outputs, what result we're getting. An input is how much am I spending for, a kilogram of cybersecurity. The output is, and what benefit did I get? Metrics are slowly becoming available. And the improvement in metrics is an area where I urge more international cooperation. For example, the cybersecurity insurance industry is beginning slowly to understand what cybersecurity losses are occurring, and they need to understand because they can't price cybersecurity insurance if they don't. We are beginning to get some data, both in the US and internationally and globally, about the effects of cybersecurity ransomware, of how much is being held at ransom and what companies are paying. If law enforcement works globally together, transparently, we can improve the quality, the quantity and quality of data relating to ransomware, both in terms of what is happening and how much is being paid. If we have that information and we disseminate that information, we can do a better job of explaining to people what they have at stake and what they need and what they need to do about it. Let me make one other point. Also explaining to people what to do could benefit from having a good common structure, whether or not it's the cybersecurity maturity model or the cybersecurity framework from the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the States, but having a logical way of structuring a program that is easy to understand and commonly understood would be another way of helping people demystify a very complex subject. This does not have to be mysterious. It can be explained clearly. Good metrics, good international cooperation to develop those metrics, and common frameworks to develop cybersecurity programs can help.
Yeah, and I think those are all really good points in the sense that having a framework like NIST, for example, 800, which you mentioned, or the new CMMC for the U.S. government, those kinds of things, I think do indeed demystify it for a lot of organizations and give them that foundational roadmap, that framework that they can start snapping in, their execution and implementation of a project on. I think that's a really good point. We actually have, I think, a question that dovetails essentially pretty good with that from the public. And Agvile, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And the question is, according to the accountability of the cybersecurity strategy, who do you think should play a role in ensuring that accountability, that cyber strategy is implemented as expected? Just if Sam is talking about the frameworks that we're going to use for the guidelines, how are we assuring the accountability of who is basically going to be executing that for us?
Yes, thank you for this question. A very good question. It relates to the governance mechanism within the country. So there's no one answer who is accountable for that. At the end of the day, it's probably the government if it's approved at the government level. It could be the parliament if it is approved as a piece of legislation. But in terms of accountability, it is very important to establish the mechanism of governance of the cybersecurity strategy and monitoring and evaluation mechanism. So if a country has a national cybersecurity strategy together with the implementation plan, so at the lowest level, a lot of public agencies, maybe private actors, would be responsible and accountable for the implementations of particular pieces of elements of national cybersecurity strategy that they were assigned to or agreed to implement. At the high level, some countries choose to have some kind of interagency steering mechanisms where they discuss the ways, the progress achieved, what has been done, what are the delays, whether there is a need to revise a plan of action because it is not working, there's a lack of funding. So to sum it up, each country has its different strategic frameworks. And in terms of accountability, should be a specific agreement and understanding within the government who is accountable for the overall implementation of the strategy. And of course, it comes together with the resources. So who is assigned the resources for the implementation of a national cybersecurity strategy? Because as we started at the beginning, and I think Andrea had mentioned, so if there are no resources, financial resources attributed to that, how you can implement those actions. So yeah, in short, these are my thoughts, and thank you for the question.
And thank you. And I think those are really good points. And I think it also actually, interestingly enough, dovetails with another question from the audience, which just wonderful questions. Please feel free to keep them coming. We'll try to get them going, but we're going to actually pivot a little bit. And I think this dovetails with your answer, Agvile. But Irfan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because one of the things that we've talked about, I think in the last few years in the cybersecurity community, I know either when I'm on stage, I'm getting questions on this, or if I'm in the audience, somebody is talking about it, and that is the supply chain. And one of the questions that we have from the audience is, many countries are including their national cybersecurity principles aspects related to the development of supply chain controls and homegrown technologies to be developed in critical services. How important is it to include such an aspect for developing countries, and what are the best practices in this direction? I think that's a great question.
I think it's a really good question. It's a really important one, and the timing couldn't have been better. I think the panel represents a number of different countries, all of which have very different views on this. So I don't think there is an answer on this yet. I think everyone is trying to do their own thing, and this is still happening across the world. I would say this has become really important in the last couple of years as we've become a bit more aware of what supply chain security means for not just critical national infrastructure, but for businesses. So some of this will depend on how reliant you are on external technologies, what you consider to be a trusted supplier, and what those actual vulnerabilities are. Remember that these are not kind of esoteric concepts that we're talking about. We are talking about disruption of services. So supply chain is one way to look at risk, and that's a risk set of risks that are across the economy. But of course, you know, your cybersecurity strategy can't be reliant on one thing or another. So supply chain might be one area, but you know, managing risk and being able to recover from cyber threats is an important one as well. You know, having the skills and industrial base in the country to be able to rebuild after an attack is important as well. And just because you have certain protocols over supply chain does not mean that you are risk free. And I think that in itself is a risk. Relying on, you know, the silver bullet of something that's high profile at the moment and take your attention off other things. I think the other thing we need to remember is, you know, there's a huge trade-off here. So we talk about the importance of cybersecurity, particularly post-COVID, because we're much more reliant on technologies now than we were 7 months ago. I think what the last 7 months has also told us is that our technologies are quite resilient. There's very few stories around the world of entire sectors of industry switching off. People have largely been able to continue their work. They've largely been able to adapt to new circumstances, and it is because our technology is resilient. So there's a trade-off here on how much you want to encourage growth and how much you want to you know, make sure you have all of your bases covered. And that's why we talk about cyber in terms of risk management, because there are trade-offs, and this is about prioritizing.
Right, and I think that's an excellent answer, and I think it covers a lot of the basis. You know, in my own experience, one of the things that I see where supply chain assurance is lacking is in contingency planning, you know, for that exact event. And I think the world really needs to start focusing on building that awareness in supply chain into the contingencies with that. But I also think that and Andrea, I think this would be a great question for you here. But let's talk and pivot real quick to ICT, because given the pervasive nature of information and communication technology, or ICT, throughout the world, an ongoing issue for policymakers is essentially how to best define a cybersecurity strategy that works for the benefit of the government, of industry, as you know, was just mentioned, not to mention civil society as well. So how can governments elaborate approaches on at basically the strategic level to balance you know, accepted norms of a country with the opportunities presented by the internet, which I think really dovetails onto the supply chain issue you know, very well.
Yeah, and it's connected to the statement I made before that you know, identifying borders in internet or cyberspace or ICT infrastructures, now it's impossible. So first of all, I don't have the solution. I don't have the recipe. I can only help governments, you know, identifying and better understanding all these variables. First is understanding that there's not national ICT. I know that many governments are, in particular, some large governments are focusing the attention on technical ICT sovereignty. But the reality is that we live in a global world. We live in a connected world when even some large countries or very large countries, they struggle to deal with the dynamics of the ICT market if they work in isolation. If we look, you know, what's going on in 5G, even, you know, the largest countries are, you know, struggling to deal with the problem by themselves, and they're looking to build, you know, political alliances or alignments to try to push what they think it's, you know, in their eyes, the right move to do. So I think it's important for most governments, if not all, to recognize that when dealing with technology, there are no borders, and there are not only the technology vendors, there are multiple dimensions that overlap with very different boundaries. You have international regulators, because sometimes, you know, a problem might be solved not by a technological vendor, but by a standardization body, or by an international organization, or by a group of companies that are heavy users of those technologies, and they might drive, changes in that specific technology. Things are becoming worse now with IoT. Why? Because the number of connections is exponentially increasing, and you can define in a precise way a subset of the global digital ecosystem. So again, I'm not giving the solution because I don't have it. I can only recommend, first of all, not to do damages, to stop and understand the complexity of the ecosystem and all the players involved. Second, engage the as many actors as possible, not only the national actors. Sometimes, or most of the time, the national actors have limited tools, and that's where governments working together makes a lot of sense, because when dealing with global problems like security of core interoperable infrastructures, it's not something that a single government can manage by itself. Even the European Union, 27 countries together, they struggle. They have, of course, more power than the single member state, but yet if they try to fight the problem or address the problem by themselves, we're already seeing the results. It's not enough.
Right, and I think that's a really good point that you make. It really does, at the end of the day, come down to that collaboration, that communication between different governments, different entities, and all of that. And I think there are different forms, I think, of communication that we need to really address here, because one is, again, that collaboration globally that we need to have on this. But the other one, or the other part of this, and Chris, I'm looking to you and first to answer this question, is communication during a crisis or during an incident. Because when cyber attacks occur, there's a wide variety of stakeholders involved in managing the crisis, including things like operators, civil society, governmental agencies, and on and on and on. And so how can communication during a crisis be improved? How can coordination between different stakeholders be beneficial for the overall capability to essentially deal with and absorb incidents?
I think that's a really, really good question, and it's something we struggle with all the time in incidents, with who gets the message out, who's the point person, who can speak, who can't speak. So again, I'll draw back on my experience in CERT UK. We were the designated National Incident Management Organization. And the reason that changed from sort of the previous world of physical contingencies and challenges was that in those days, a lot of that was government controlled. And as someone pointed out earlier, in the UK, 85% of the critical national infrastructure is not owned by the government. The government doesn't understand how it works. The government has no control over it. And frankly, if you were one of those companies, you don't really want government people coming in to help you fix it, because government doesn't know it well enough to do so. So we had to work out a way of bridging both the government side of information, and obviously there are various sources of information, both within the UK government, but also governmental relations with other countries around the world, but also bring in the private sector piece into an environment that up until then had been solely government. The UK's crisis management construct, essentially, you may have heard it's a thing called COBRA. Its briefing room in the Cabinet Office is a very government thing. There's no private sector in there. I don't know that they've ever been in there. And that was a real challenge. Based off of, oddly enough, the Olympics. When Britain had the Olympics in 2012, they set up they realized there that this was going to be a challenge, and they needed to meld both government and private sector and so on together. And they built what they called the OCT, the Olympic Cyber Coordination Team, I think it was. And that was the model we used. So what we did as the CERT was, although we called ourselves a CERT, to be fair, in the strict interpretation of what a CERT is, we weren't. We were an information sharing and analysis center with a coordinating role as well. That's what we did. So we got information in, we talked to all the players, we would get that information in, and my job was to go and sit in that meeting with whoever was in charge and explain the single truth. This is what we know now. This is that we've taken all the data from all of these separate bits of government and private sector, and we built this one report. This is what we're doing. And that's so critical in a crisis, to have that one single voice telling you what the challenges is. Now, government construct then is not so much to fix the problem, although they want to. The government challenge really is to fix the outcomes of that problem. So if someone, for instance, hacks a power station and turns it off, government obviously wants to turn it back on, but what they're really interested in is how that is affecting the civil population. Is that causing, shops to close, traffic lights to fail, people to die in hospitals and so on? That's what government is trying to solve, more than how do we fix the problem to turn the power station back on. Obviously, in that case, it's fairly binary, but there's a lot more about managing the outcomes of these things. And again, at that point, having that single voice going in, telling what the problem is, really critical. So we did that essentially through a lot of awareness, a lot of talking to people, a lot of making sure that that role was absolutely, black and white defined. This is what our role is. When there is an incident, we are the people who talk in this meeting, not you, not you, not you, no one else, it's us. You have to come to us. So we would manage those incidents very strongly to make sure that we weren't getting multiple messages. I'm always open for a debate about what the message is, but what I don't want is multiple people talking into that single point, that government construct with, well, we think it's this and we think it's this. Unfortunately, at some point you have to make that clear. The second thing to do is to do a lot of exercises. You exercise, you train, you rinse, you repeat, you modify, you improve. Every time you learn better, and every time people will see the benefits of that very structured information gathering and reporting structure. And that again almost came down to awareness again. So as part of what we did, we reached out certainly to the critical national infrastructure, and over time much more out to the supply chain, to explain what our role was, why we were here. We had a collaboration platform that we could use to talk to them and to gather that information. But it sounds very boring, but it is really, you have to be structured in doing this. You cannot just have someone turn up and wing it in these cases. Cyber moves too fast, it scales too fast, it's too international. None of these things are helped by having confused messages at the top.
Right, I completely agree. One of the things about cybersecurity, unlike I would say standard technology, is that we oftentimes have to pivot on a dime. I like to say we never know when that 15-year-old kid is going to hack Google, and now the entire game has been changed by virtue of nobody thinking of this particular methodology before. But I also think it speaks to what you were saying about the government just doesn't necessarily understand about, let's say, things like becoming an internet service provider, or how that communication works. It's dealing with the private sector. And so Sam, I actually want to pivot to you on this, speaking of pivoting, because you've obviously worked with probably one of the largest and most confederated and complex governments on the planet, which is the United States, which I think in and of itself has a lot of different challenges when you have so many moving parts and aspects to a national government, any national government. And so Sam, what are some of the main challenges and obstacles preventing governments from ensuring effective monitoring and evaluation for the implementation of a national cybersecurity strategy?
Thank you, Nick. Great question. There are several challenges a national government will have. And one of those challenges is to get reliable information about who is doing what, when it is being done, how effective it is. One lesson that we have learned is that having good industry and technology specific information sharing and analysis organizations or information sharing and analysis centers can be useful. It brings together an industry, energy or transportation or financial services or healthcare, so that they share information. It also provides a mechanism for them to share information with government and for them to receive from the government information about current threats and what works. Now, this isn't perfect. Government is not always in a position to share the most sensitive information. And sometimes industry is worried about sharing information with government that might include personally identifiable information. And we have in our country had to contend with these and very difficult issues. On the other hand, I think we're doing better. We are seeing that information sharing is improving in specific industries and across industries that are working on things like IoT and smart infrastructure. That sharing is also leading us to identify some of the gaps that have to be closed. Sometimes we don't know enough about the vulnerability of systems that use AI, or the vulnerability of systems with large attack surfaces because of numerous IoT devices, perhaps as many as 1 million IoT devices per square kilometer. I want to, however, focus my answer a little bit more on developing countries, countries that are only now building an advanced information and communications technology infrastructure, their own cyber ecosystem, and that may not have had in the past the resources necessary to build up a cybersecurity ecosystem to support their IT ecosystem. I would recommend that these countries, the developing countries, pay special attention as they develop new IT infrastructures and new smart cities infrastructures and make those investments or have access to their investments. They should ask what information what information is collected in these infrastructures, who secures that infrastructure. How is the governance of that security going to be managed? Asking these questions early can help put in place the policy and strategy architectures that developing countries also need. And in doing so, they can avoid some of the gaps that perhaps the industrial countries experienced because we didn't look at this soon enough. So Nick, I hope that answer is helpful to you.
It is. And I think it actually really starts to dovetail into what is going to be the last question in our discussion, just due to time limits, in terms of actionable items and things that we can start implementing and really looking at as well. And so, Agvile, you get the honor of having the very last question that I'm going to be giving here today. And so, I essentially want to talk about effective policing in cyberspace because it's driven by information. So when an incident occurs in some way, shape, or form, that information must be promptly accessible to law enforcement, and other organizations that need it. So to what extent, basically have nations developed information sharing mechanisms between cybersecurity bodies such as CERTs, SOCs, national cybersecurity agencies, and law enforcement? And in terms of actionable, what are best practices, do you think, in this direction? How does this improve the overall cyber resilience? And you get the final word. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm very honored to have this final word in our very interesting discussion about policing and cyber domain. So incident response teams, they work on preventing and mitigating cyber incidents. Law enforcement works on reducing the number of threat actors that incident response teams do not care that much. But sharing of the information between the two is a very crucial aspect in helping both CSIRTs and law enforcement to achieve their objectives, because information can feed to one organization's works and to the others. So CSIRTs, they do not have the powers of law enforcement vis-a-vis private actors. And regarding attacks of the criminal nature, have an important role to play in investigation and especially in securing electronic evidence, as they are the first responders when something, a big incident is happening and they're dealing with a lot of information. It is very important that in terms of the prosecution of a crime, if it is a crime, not just an incident, evidence is not deleted and it is maintained in line with the standards that will be later admissible to court. So in terms of sharing information across the countries, it is getting better. Law enforcement organizations work with incident response teams and vice versa. But as I mentioned at the beginning, legal and policy contexts play an important role, how it is implemented on a national level. So especially important is how a nation shares evidence with other countries, how the nation or the country is engaged in international cooperation, which organizations it cooperates, which countries it cooperates and shares information. What are data protection standards? Because a lot of information after the adoption of GDPR within the European Union is attributable as a personal identifiable information, and certs have a lot of that information and have a regulation whether it can be shared. Another important element to think for nations when developing mechanisms for information sharing between law enforcement and CSIRTs is how cybercrime is defined. So what is the scope and the mandate to share that information? So these are, I think, important elements for the nations to think, and when developing regulation policies or national cybersecurity strategies, to think, whether it should be a voluntary or whether the nation should put a requirement for the CSIRT to report suspicious activities to the law enforcement when discovered during the incident. So there's one question for a nation to think about. Do CSIRTs will your national or sectorial incident response team will play a role in criminal investigation, for example, by providing technical experience, because they are most technically experienced people at the national level in courts and supporting evidence collections. What will be the rules for that? And from the law enforcement side, it is also very important to make sure that it is not a one-way street. So how law enforcement will ensure the secrecy investigation and will help CSIRTs in their work that they are doing. And yeah, I think these are the bullets I wanted to mention upon, which I think are important in devising policies and strategies and enforcing cooperation and information sharing between law enforcement agencies and CSIRTs. But to build that, I believe the most important element is trust, how each organization trusts each other, transparency, knowing how information will be used if it is shared, and the need to enhance that cooperation if we want to address and reduce the number of threat actors on the internet is very important. So that would be my answer. And thank you for the question and final question.
And thank you. And I think that is a great way to end it. And real quick, we're going to take an extra 10 minutes just to wrap this up. So interpreters, if you could stay on for another 10 minutes or so, we're just going to give every panelist a quick word real quick. But thank you to everybody for attending. Obviously, thank you to the panelists. Just some excellent conversations. This is definitely going to be the highlight of my week, I'm sure. There's no doubt of that. And make sure that everybody, you check out Mural as well. You can see it here shared on the screen, but there's a lot of really good points that are being made on that. And the last thing I want to do, as we're wrapping up here, is essentially to give every panelist the ability to tell them, or rather tell you how you can find them in the world, whether that's LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever that is. And so with that, Andrea, if you would start us, how can people find you if they want to contact you or get more information from you?
So I'm very active in the international community. So if you go on, LinkedIn, you find me, you find my name on many ITU projects and initiatives, or in the chat, I will drop my email address. Of course, I work for a private company, but I'm doing a lot of work for international organizations, contributing to the development of new strategies, new initiatives in cybersecurity. So always very happy to connect with other people. As I said, I truly believe in joining forces.
Thank you. Yeah, your answers are absolutely fantastic, and I appreciate your time. Thank you. With that, Sam, how can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more or ask you a question?
Thank you, Nick. I'm easy to find. My email address is svisner@mitre.org. I'm also active on LinkedIn. One can look at MITRE's webpage and also at Georgetown University. for cybersecurity activities in which I am involved. If you are a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as I am, I also post occasionally to the Council on Foreign Relations members wall. So as I said, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm active on social media, and I'm active as well in the print media regarding social cybersecurity. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you. Chris, why don't you go next? How can we learn more about you?
So if you want to learn more about FIRST, it's very simple. It's www.first.org. My email address is chris@first.org, so very easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I'm on a bunch of places, but those two will find me very quickly.
All right. I don't think I'll ever remember that, for the record, but
Chris@first.org. Come on.
Fair enough.
Complicated stuff.
Fair enough. All right. Agvile, how can we get a hold of you or learn more about you?
Yeah, I'm active also on LinkedIn. So, and I will be moving to New York in 2 weeks. So if the participants are from the member states, I can be contacted through their permanent missions. So just, and also if there's a capacity building assistance from the Office of Counterterrorism in terms of preventing and countering terrorist use of new technologies and cyber. So permanent missions are also the channel to request that capacity building assistance from the UN.
All right, thank you, thank you. And I believe Irfan actually dropped due to connection issues. So Irfan, if you're here, speak up. If not, we'll move on. So Pratima, let's go to you. If people want to learn more about you and Bhutan and everything else, where can they find you?
I'm in LinkedIn as well, but I think why should anybody know about me? I will drop my email ID here. Yes, LinkedIn and my email ID. Oops, sorry, that's not, there's a title. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone.
And thank you, thank you. And Martin, if everybody wants to learn about what you're doing or follow you, where can we find you?
Just like any other person, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I will drop an email at the chat, along the chat, for everyone to get a hold of me. We do a lot of work within the Commonwealth. I'm sure some of the members on the line, members that we've interacted with at different platforms. Internationally, I do quite a bit with the IT as usual, and also with many Commonwealth countries that we do a lot of development work and within the UK. So I'll do that. And thank you so much for the invite and for the opportunity.
And thank you, and thank you. And I do believe that wraps us up. Most of the panelists have put their email addresses or other forms in the chat. You can find me at Nick AESP on Twitter or / Nick Espinoza on LinkedIn. And I put my email in the chat as well. So please feel free to drop me a line if you need anything from me as well. And I believe this wraps this up. I'd like to thank the ITU for basically putting this together so we could discuss National Cybersecurity Strategy, probably one of the most important things that the world is addressing and tackling today. And so once again, thanks to everybody that participated. Thanks to everybody that followed along, that asked us questions, and will contact us in the future. We really appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a great day wherever you are. Take care.
Thank you.